My husband said, "My ex is coming to our family dinner." I smiled. Great. But he didn't know I also invited her new husband and showed him all my husband's messages with her. What happened next made, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Mae Calloway, and I was 67 years old when my life as I had known it for 31 years began to quietly unravel at the edges. The way a good tablecloth does when someone keeps pulling at the same loose thread. I had built something real. That was the thing people always forgot to say about women like me. We built things. I had raised 2 children, kept a house in Savannah, Georgia that smelled of lemon polish and Sunday pot roast, and I had loved my husband, Gerald, the way only a woman who has chosen the same man twice. Once at the altar, and once again in the middle of a bad winter, truly knows how to love. Gerald was 69, retired from 30 years in civil engineering, and he filled the house with NPR and the smell of his morning coffee. We were not a perfect couple, but we were a real one. Our daughter, Patricia, lived 40 minutes away with her husband, Tom, and their 2 boys. Our son, Michael, had moved to Atlanta 8 years ago and called every Sunday without fail. We had grandchildren who called me Grandma Dot and left muddy footprints on my kitchen floor. I had a garden. I had a book club. I had a life that, from the outside, looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. And then the thread began to pull. It started small. Gerald's phone, always left on the kitchen counter while he showered, began traveling with him to the bathroom. A small thing. A nothing thing, really. But I noticed it the way you notice a picture frame that's slightly crooked. Not enough to stop you in your tracks, but enough that your eye keeps returning to it. Then there were the evenings he came home from his Wednesday golf with Bill, smelling not of the course, but of something else. Something warmer and indoor, like a restaurant or a living room that wasn't ours. Bill, I later learned from a chance conversation with Bill's wife, Carolyn, had not played golf with Gerald in over 2 months. I did not panic. I am not a woman who panics. I observed. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when the thread finally snapped. I was at the kitchen table going through coupons, a habit Gerald always teased me about, when he came in from the den with an expression I can only describe as carefully arranged. He sat down across from me. He folded his hands on the table. Gerald only folded his hands like that when he was about to say something he had rehearsed. "Dot," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to stay calm." I set down my scissors. "Renee is going to be at the family dinner next month." Renee, his ex-wife. The woman he had been married to for 4 years before he met me. The woman I had heard about in pieces over 31 years. A failed real estate venture here. A difficult personality there. Always described by Gerald in the flattened, distant tones of someone speaking about a chapter of life that was well and truly closed. Renee Hartley. She had remarried years ago to a man named Douglas, and according to Gerald, they had both been civil about it. I had never met her. I had never had reason to. Patricia invited her, Gerald added quickly, which I did not believe for 1 second. They reconnected at a charity event. She thought it would be mature. Adult. I looked at him. He was watching me with the particular alertness of a man who has prepared for an argument and is not sure whether to be relieved or worried that it hasn't started yet. I smiled. It was not a performance, or rather it was, but a very good one, built from 31 years of knowing when to keep my cards against my chest. "That's fine," I said. "If Patricia wants her there, that's perfectly fine." Gerald exhaled. He reached over and patted my hand. "I knew you'd be reasonable about it. Reasonable." I tucked that word away like a stone in my pocket. I would take it out later when I was alone and turn it over in my hands and decide exactly what to do with it. Because sitting at that table, watching my husband's careful face relax into relief, I already knew something he did not. I had already felt the shape of the thing between them, the heat of it, the direction of it. A woman who has loved one man for 31 years develops a sense for these things the way a farmer develops a sense for weather. The storm was coming. I had felt it in my bones for weeks. What he didn't know was that I had already begun to prepare. After Gerald went to bed that night, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet in the way old houses are quiet, full of small sounds that have become invisible through familiarity. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the radiator pipes, the occasional creak of the settling foundation. I had loved this house. I still did. That was the complicated part of it. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, something I rarely did, and I let myself think clearly for the first time in weeks. What did I actually know? I am a practical woman. I have always preferred facts over feelings, not because I lack feelings, but because I have learned over 67 years that feelings without facts are just weather. They pass over you. They do not help you navigate. Fact. Gerald had stopped leaving his phone on the kitchen counter. Fact. He had lied about playing golf with Bill for at least 2 months. Fact. He had announced with a rehearsed calmness that I knew as well as I knew his handwriting that his ex-wife would be at our family dinner. Fact. Patricia had not mentioned this to me. Not once. And Patricia told me everything. I called Patricia the next morning after Gerald left for his walk. She answered on the second ring, and when I asked her directly whether she had invited Renee Hartley to Thanksgiving dinner, there was a pause. A small, terrible pause. Before she said, "Dad asked me if it would be okay, Mom. He said she was going through a hard time and he wanted to help." I thanked Patricia and told her everything was fine. After I hung up, I sat with that for a moment. He had asked Patricia to cover for him. He had recruited our daughter into a small, tidy lie. That was new. That told me the situation was further along than I had assumed. I was not a woman who fell apart. I want to be clear about that. I had buried my mother at 42, managed a household through Gerald's layoff in 2001, raised 2 children through the ordinary heartbreaks of childhood and adolescence. I was not fragile, but I was, that morning, genuinely afraid. Not of Renee Hartley, but of what her presence in our life might mean, of what the next chapter of my life might look like if I was not careful. What does a woman of 67 do when she suspects her husband of 31 years may be involved with his ex-wife? What are her realistic options? I turned them over like cards on a table. She could confront him directly. I had considered this and rejected it. Gerald was a careful man. He would deny. He would minimize. He would call me paranoid and give me just enough warmth to make me doubt myself. I had seen this happen to other women. I would not allow it to happen to me. She could ignore it and hope it passed. This I rejected with something approaching contempt. I had not spent 31 years building a life to abandon it to willful blindness. She could gather information first. Yes. This was the only answer that made sense to me. Before I did anything, before I said a single word, I needed to know the truth. Not a feeling, not a suspicion. The actual, documentable truth. I was not without resources. I was retired, but I was not idle. My late friend Carol's son, Marcus, ran a small private investigation firm in Savannah. I had met him at Carol's funeral 2 years ago, and he had given me his card with the sincerity of someone who meant it. I had kept the card in the small drawer of my writing desk, the way I kept everything that might someday matter. I also thought about Renee's husband, Douglas Hartley. Gerald had mentioned him only in passing over the years, a financial consultant of some kind, pleasant, quiet. If Renee and Gerald were conducting some kind of renewed relationship, what did Douglas know? Did he suspect? Was he in the same position I was, sitting in his own kitchen, turning over the same quiet evidence? And then, slowly, the shape of a plan began to form. It was not a plan born of revenge. Not yet. It was born of a desire for truth and for dignity. I wanted to walk into that family dinner with full knowledge of what was happening in my own life. I wanted, for once, not to be the last person in the room to know. I opened my writing desk drawer and found Marcus Webb's card. I poured the rest of the bourbon down the sink. I needed to be clear-headed. I had work to do. Marcus Webb was a quiet man in his early 40s who wore plain clothes and spoke in measured sentences. The kind of man you would forget in a crowd, which was, I supposed, precisely the point. I met him at a coffee shop on Broughton Street on a Thursday morning, having told Gerald I was going to my book club. Gerald had not even looked up from his newspaper. I told Marcus what I knew and what I suspected. I kept my voice steady. He listened without interrupting, which I respected. When I finished, he asked 3 precise questions. How long had the behavior changes been occurring? Did I have any existing record of Gerald's communications? Texts, emails, anything? And did I know Renee Hartley's current address? I had the address. I had found it, with moderate effort, through the Chatham County property records, which are public. Gerald had mentioned years ago that Renee had bought a place in the Ardsley Park neighborhood after her second marriage. It had not been difficult to locate. Marcus told me his rate and what he could and could not do legally. He was very clear about that. He could document physical meetings in public spaces. He could not access private communications. He could provide a record of movements and patterns. He told me the work would take a minimum of 2 weeks and that I should not change my behavior at home in any way that might make Gerald suspicious. I wrote him a check and went home and made dinner. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned the discipline of stillness. I smiled at breakfast. I asked Gerald about his walk. I attended my book club. Actually attended, which meant I had to read 40 pages of a novel I could barely concentrate on. And I waited. Meanwhile, I began to notice that Gerald was watching me differently. Not with guilt. Gerald was too practiced at compartmentalization for guilt to surface easily. But with a new, evaluating attentiveness, as if he was calibrating me, measuring my reactions against some internal expectation. Once, when I came home from an errand, 20 minutes later than expected, I found him in the hallway with a look that disappeared too quickly for me to name. He asked where I'd been. I told him the drugstore line was long. He nodded. He went back to the den. He was checking on me, that was new. I also called Douglas Hartley. This took considerable nerve, and I will not pretend otherwise. I had found his number through his business. He worked for a financial consultancy that had a website, and the website listed a general inquiry email, from which I obtained a phone number through a politely worded inquiry as a prospective client. I called from my cell phone during one of Gerald's walks and identified myself only as Dorothy, a name that by itself would mean nothing to him. I did not tell him who I was or why I was calling. Not yet. I simply established that he existed, that he answered his own phone, and that he sounded like a tired man. There was something in his voice, a flatness, a kind of practiced politeness over a hollow space, that I recognized. It was the sound of someone who had also been wondering. I told him I had the wrong number and apologized. He said it was no trouble. I sat with that for a while. Marcus called me on a Friday evening when Gerald was in the shower. He asked me if I could meet him the following morning. His voice was neutral, but the kind of neutral that carried weight beneath it. I met him at the same coffee shop. He set a plain manila envelope on the table between us. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I want to prepare you before you open this." I told him I was prepared. Inside the envelope were 8 photographs. Clear, time-stamped, taken in public spaces. A parking lot behind a restaurant on Montgomery Street. The waterfront park on River Street. Once at a table visible through a restaurant window. Gerald and a woman I recognized from an old photograph he had once shown me years ago. Darker hair then, now silver blonde, still striking. They were not doing anything overtly scandalous in any single image, but taken together, The way he touched the small of her back, the way she leaned toward him in a particular manner, the way neither of them moved with the unconscious ease of old friends. Taken together, the photographs told a story that was absolutely, unmistakably clear. There was also a log, dates and times. 14 meetings over the past 2 weeks. 14. I put the photographs back in the envelope, closed the clasp, and placed it in my purse. "Thank you, Marcus," I said. I left a tip on the table, stood up, and walked out into the autumn morning. I had what I needed. Now I had to decide what to do with it. The family dinner was the Saturday before Thanksgiving. I had called Douglas Hartley again 4 days before, this time properly, with my full name, with clarity, and without apology. I told him who I was. I told him what I had. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "How long?" I told him, 14 documented meetings in 2 weeks, and that I believed it had been ongoing for longer. He asked if we could meet. I said yes. We met at a neutral location, a library meeting room I reserved under a false pretext. Douglas was a trim man in his early 60s with silver hair and the particular posture of someone who had been holding tension in his shoulders for a long time. I showed him the photographs. I showed him the log. He looked at each one carefully, without expression, the way a man looks at something he has already half known but needed to see confirmed before he could act. He thanked me. I told him I planned to invite him to the dinner. He said he would come. I also, quietly, told Patricia what I knew, not everything, but enough. Patricia cried. Then she got angry. Then she composed herself with a speed that reminded me she was, after all, my daughter. She told me she would not interfere, but she would be there. The dinner was at our house. I cooked because I have always cooked, and because doing something familiar with my hands kept me calm. By the time Gerald helped me set the table at 5 o'clock, I was the steadiest I had been in weeks. Renee arrived with Gerald's orchestrated casualness, as though her presence at our table were a normal, administrative matter. She was elegantly dressed and carried a bottle of wine and wore the particular expression of a woman who has decided to be gracious in a situation she has constructed herself. She greeted me warmly. I greeted her warmly in return. We were both, for the moment, performing. Douglas arrived 12 minutes later. The moment Renee saw him in the doorway, her face did something involuntary. A small, rapid reorganization, like a deck of cards quickly shuffled. Gerald, who was carrying a serving dish from the kitchen, stopped in the doorway and looked from Douglas to me. His expression moved through surprise and into something colder and more calculating. "Dorothy," he said, with the careful tone of a man choosing his first word in a negotiation. I didn't know Douglas was coming. "I invited him," I said pleasantly. "I thought it would be nice for Renee to have her husband here." We sat down to dinner. It lasted 40 minutes before it broke apart. I had shown Douglas, before the dinner, the relevant text messages. I had found Gerald's second phone, a prepaid one, in the pocket of his winter coat in the hall closet, 2 days after meeting Marcus. I had photographed every conversation on it with my own phone. What Douglas confronted Renee with, quietly and then less quietly, at my dinner table, was specific and irrefutable. Gerald turned to me. His voice was low and very controlled. "You had no right," he said. "To know the truth about my own marriage?" I replied. He said, later, after Renee and Douglas had left, Renee in tears, Douglas in silence, that I had ambushed him, that I had weaponized a private situation, that I was vindictive and manipulative, and that he could not believe I had done this in front of our daughter. He was standing in the kitchen, and his voice had the quality of something that has been stored under pressure. I let him finish. Then I said, "Gerald, I know everything. I have known for weeks, and I have documentation." I set a copy of Marcus's photographs on the counter between us. "I think we should talk to a lawyer." He stared at the photographs. Something went out of his face. He tried, in the days that followed, to manage the situation, to call it a misunderstanding, to suggest counseling, to position himself as a man who had made a mistake and deserved a second chance. Renee called my cell phone twice. I did not answer. After the third day of this, I checked myself into a bed and breakfast in Tybee Island for 4 nights. I told Patricia where I was and told her I needed quiet. I walked on the beach in November, which is cold and gray and absolutely beautiful. I drank good tea. I read the novel I'd been ignoring for my book club, and I thought about what came next. On the third morning at Tybee Island, Gerald drove out to find me. I was sitting on the porch of the bed and breakfast with my tea when his car turned into the gravel drive. I had known he would come eventually. I watched him park and walk toward me with the studied evenness of a man who had rehearsed his approach during the 2-hour drive from Savannah. He sat down across from me without being invited. He looked tired. He looked frankly older than he had a week ago, which was something I observed without particular satisfaction. "Dot," he said. 31 years. "Yes," I said. "We can't throw that away." "Gerald," I said, "I'm not the one who threw anything." He talked for 20 minutes. He was good at it. He had always been good with words, a precise, reasonable man, and he deployed that precision now. He spoke about the length of our marriage, about our grandchildren, about the life we had built, about how what had happened with Renee was a failure of judgment that he was prepared to take responsibility for, if I would give him the chance. He said the word mistake 4 times. He did not say the word sorry once, which told me everything I needed to know about how much he had actually changed in the 4 days since our kitchen confrontation. I listened. I let him finish. Then I said, "I'll be home Sunday. We can speak with an attorney Monday." He looked at me as though I were a person he was seeing for the first time. Perhaps he was. Perhaps the Dorothy he had known for 31 years had absorbed his reasonable, controlled manner so thoroughly that when she turned it back on him, with full, quiet force, he did not recognize her. He drove back to Savannah. Renee's second call came that evening. This time I answered because I had decided I wanted to hear what she would say. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't intended for things to go this far. She said she had always respected me, which was so transparently false that I almost admired the nerve of it. Then she said, and this was the part that interested me, that she hoped we could handle this quietly, for the sake of Douglas and the children and the families involved. She said the word quietly, the way people say it when they mean in a way that benefits me. I told her I appreciated the call and wished her well. After I hung up, I sat with the satisfaction of a woman who has held her ground, but I also knew I could not do this alone. Pride is not the same as strength, and I was smart enough to know the difference. I called my friend Louise the next morning. Louise Beaumont had been my closest friend for 22 years. We had met in a neighborhood association meeting and had been, as she once said, inseparable, but never tiresome, which I thought was the finest description of a friendship I'd ever heard. I told her everything over the phone. She listened with the focused attention of a woman who was furious on my behalf and keeping it contained. "What do you need?" she asked when I'd finished. "Company," I said, "and someone who knows a good family attorney." Louise knew one. Her cousin Sandra had gone through her own divorce 6 years prior and had used an attorney named Helen Park, who worked out of a firm on Bull Street and had, according to Louise, the quiet authority of a woman who has seen everything and is not surprised by any of it. I called Helen Park's office that afternoon and made an appointment for the following Thursday. I also, on Louise's gentle suggestion, scheduled an appointment with a therapist, a woman named Dr. Amara Collins, who worked with older adults navigating major life transitions. I had never been to therapy. I was skeptical. But I was also 67 years old and smart enough to know that being skeptical of things you've never tried is simply another form of pride. I arrived home Sunday, as I had said I would. Gerald was in the kitchen. He looked at me and said nothing. I made myself a cup of tea and went to the living room and read for the rest of the evening. I was not angry. I was not sad exactly. I was something that didn't have a clean name, a combination of clarity and grief, and a very deliberate kind of calm, like a ship that has been reoriented after a storm and is now moving on a true heading. I had Louise. I had Helen Park. I had Dr. Collins. I had the photographs and the text messages, and a very clear sense of what I was and what I was not willing to accept. I was not alone. That mattered more than I had expected. 2 weeks after I returned from Tybee Island, they came together. I want you to understand what an act of nerve that was. Gerald and Renee arriving at my front door on a Sunday afternoon, as though the situation called for a joint presentation. Gerald must have believed there was some version of events in which this made sense. That was always his particular blindness. He confused his own confidence with logic. I had seen them pull into the drive from the kitchen window, and I had taken 10 seconds, exactly 10, to decide how I would be. Then I opened the door before they knocked. Renee was dressed softly, in gray and cream, which I suspected was deliberate. She held a small arrangement of flowers, grocery store hydrangeas, wrapped in craft paper, and she offered them to me with an expression I can only describe as performed humility. Gerald stood slightly behind her, which struck me as a telling piece of choreography. He had let her lead. That told me this had been her idea, or at least her script. "Dorothy," Renee said, "I know we have no right to ask for your time, but we hoped we could speak with you, honestly." I took the flowers. I showed them into the living room. I did not offer tea. Gerald sat on the sofa. Renee took the chair across from me. I sat in the armchair by the window, which gave me a clear sightline to both of them and the door, and I waited. What followed was approximately 35 minutes of very skilled emotional manipulation. Gerald spoke about our grandchildren first. Our daughter's boys, Tyler and James, aged 9 and 6. He spoke about Tyler's baseball season and James's difficulty with reading, and how he was worried that a protracted legal situation would unsettle the boys, disrupt their routines, reshape the only version of family they had ever known. He said the stability of children depended on the stability of the adults around them. He said it with the practiced conviction of a man who had genuinely convinced himself that concern for his grandchildren and concern for his own comfort were the same emotion. He spoke about the family as an ecosystem that could not survive disruption. He said the word family 11 times. I counted. Renee then spoke about her own regret, with the well-crafted sincerity of someone who has thought carefully about what sincerity sounds like. She said she had been in a vulnerable state emotionally. Her word was vulnerable, delivered with a slight catch in her voice that was technically impressive. She said that she and Gerald had a long history, and that old connections were complicated. She talked about loneliness in a way that was designed to generate sympathy, and I sat there and listened and thought. She is 61 years old, and she walked into my marriage with full knowledge of what she was doing, and she is using the word loneliness as though it were an explanation. She said she was not trying to excuse herself, and then proceeded to spend 7 minutes doing exactly that. Then they shifted together to the practical argument. Gerald said that if we proceeded with a formal separation, the house would be complicated. We owned it jointly, and a sale in the current market would be painful for both of us. He said my share of his pension was secure as long as we remained married. He said, and he said this with the quiet authority of a man who believes he is offering a reasonable compromise, that we could restructure our arrangement in a way that gave me financial security while allowing him more flexibility. I looked at him for a long moment. "Gerald," I said, "are you suggesting I accept an open marriage in exchange for keeping the pension?" He flinched. He said that was not what he'd said, which was technically true and practically false. "I'm consulting with Helen Park on Thursday," I said. "I've already gathered the financial documentation. I know what the pension is worth and what my share is in a dissolution. I also have the photographs and the text messages, which I've saved in multiple locations. I looked at Renee. I wish you both well, but I will not be restructuring anything, Renee said, in a voice that had dropped its performance of warmth. That I was making a very difficult situation worse. That I was being punitive. That a woman my age should be thinking about security and practicality. She said it with the particular condescension of someone who has decided that 67 is a vulnerability to exploit, rather than a life fully, carefully lived. A woman my age. I stood up. I told them they were welcome to see themselves out. Gerald paused at the door. He turned back slowly, the way people do when they've prepared a final word and intend to use it. He said something I will not repeat here because it was designed to wound, and it came close to working. He knew me well enough to know where to aim. He knew about my mother, about the years I had spent worrying I was not enough, about the particular fears that live in the interior of a woman who has given a marriage everything she had. That was the terrible intimacy of 31 years. The knowledge it gives another person of your most vulnerable architecture. He used it deliberately, precisely, and without hesitation. That, more than anything else that had happened in the preceding weeks, told me exactly who he had always been beneath the composed, reasonable surface. After they left, I locked the door and stood in my hallway for a moment. There it was. The fear. A real, cold, animal fear. The house felt very large and very quiet, and I was 67 years old, and 31 years was a long time. And for a moment I felt the full weight of what I was walking away from. Not Gerald. Not the man who had just walked out my door. But the version of my life that had felt safe and known and mine. The grief of that was real, and I did not pretend otherwise. But then I thought, he knew where to aim, and that told me everything about who he was and who I was, and what this marriage had quietly been for longer than I had let myself see. The fear didn't leave, but it changed into something harder, something I could use. Helen Park, it turned out, was a small woman in her mid-50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, with complete economy and zero waste. After our first meeting, she had advised me to take no further confrontational action while documentation was being prepared. I had listened to her almost completely. The one deviation was this: I organized a family meeting. Not a dramatic one. Not a performance. A necessary one, because Patricia deserved to hear the truth in full from me, not in fragments from her father. And because Michael, who had been calling every Sunday and sensing, with the accurate intuition of a son who knew his parents, that something was seriously wrong, deserved the same. I also knew, with the particular clarity that had settled over me in the weeks since Tybee Island, that if I allowed Gerald to continue managing the narrative within our family, he would do so successfully. He was very good at managing narratives. He had been doing it, I now understood, for 11 months at minimum. I invited Patricia and Michael to the house on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Sunday visit from Gerald and Renee. Gerald did not know about the meeting until the morning of. I told him at breakfast, calmly, that Patricia and Michael were coming at 2 o'clock and that I thought it would be best if we were all in the same room together. He looked at me and I could see him calculating whether to refuse, whether to call Patricia, whether to try to preempt whatever was coming. He said he would be there. Patricia arrived first, with Tom, who sat quietly throughout and said almost nothing, which was the most useful thing he could have done. Michael drove down from Atlanta. He embraced me at the door for a long moment without saying anything. He was 41 years old, and he had his father's height and his mother's eyes. And that afternoon I was very glad to have him in the room. Gerald sat across from me. He was dressed carefully, as though for a professional event. He had already called Patricia twice that morning, I later learned, to try to frame the meeting before it happened. Patricia had listened politely and said very little. She was, as I have said, my daughter. I let him speak first. It was a deliberate choice. I wanted the children to see what he did with an opening, how he used it, what he reached for. He spoke about complexity. He spoke about long marriages and their inevitable strains. He was measured and reasonable and positioned himself as a man navigating a difficult situation with the best intentions of everyone at heart. He did not mention Renee by name. He spoke around her the way you speak around a word you hope no one will ask you to define. I waited until he finished. Then I placed the folder Helen Park had helped me prepare on the coffee table, and I opened it. Inside, copies of the photographs, printed clearly, with timestamps visible in the lower corner of each one. A printed log of the 14 meetings documented by Marcus Webb, and the additional 8 meetings Marcus had documented in the 2 weeks following my return from Tybee Island. The text messages from the prepaid phone, printed and dated, organized chronologically, spanning 11 months. Not weeks, 11 months. Gerald had begun contacting Renee the previous December. I had worked backward through the dates, which meant that his announcement at the kitchen table in October, the one I had received with a smile and a stone in my pocket, was not the beginning of the situation. It was merely the moment he had decided to make it visible. Gerald's face changed in a way I had not seen in 31 years. The composed managerial exterior dropped, not all at once, but in stages, like a wall losing its mortar. First the eyes, then the set of the jaw, then the deliberate placement of the hands, which had been folded on his knee and now separated, as though he no longer trusted them to hold their position. He said that the messages had been misinterpreted. He said that context was missing. He said that Marcus Webb had been hired to, and here he turned to me with something that was almost contempt, spy on him, in his own home, which was a violation of his privacy and possibly illegal. Marcus documented public meetings, I said. You're welcome to raise the legality with your own attorney. You went through my phone, he said. You left it in your coat pocket, I said. I found it when I was hanging the coat. Michael said, very quietly, Dad, the room was still. Outside, a car passed. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Small, ordinary sounds, completely indifferent to what was happening in the living room. Renee was not present. She was not family, and was not invited. But her name was present, in black ink, across 11 months of printed text messages on my coffee table, in front of my children. There is no performing your way out of a printed document. There is no managing the narrative when the narrative is already on the table, dated and organized and undeniable. Gerald tried twice more to reframe. He attempted the language of nuance, of complexity, of a long marriage's private difficulties that could not be reduced to documents. He was skilled at it. I will say that plainly, because it is true. But Patricia had read the messages. Michael had read the dates. You cannot perform nuance in the face of 11 months of evidence. And Gerald Calloway, who had always trusted his own intelligence absolutely, could not locate an argument that moved anyone in the room. He looked at his son's face. He looked at his daughter's. Whatever he saw, there was apparently sufficient, because he stopped trying after the second attempt. He sat back in his chair and looked at the folder on the coffee table with the expression of a man who has just understood, fully and finally, that the situation is no longer his to manage. The room stayed quiet. I let it stay quiet. I had nothing to perform and no point left to make. I've retained Helen Park, I said at last. She'll be in contact with you about next steps. Gerald said nothing. That was its own answer. The clearest one he'd given me in a very long time. The divorce took 8 months. Helen Park had told me at the outset that dissolution of a 31-year marriage in Georgia could be straightforward or complicated depending on the choices both parties made. Gerald at first chose complicated. He retained an attorney, a man named Clifford Baines from a firm on Abercorn Street, who sent Helen a letter within the first 2 weeks suggesting that my gathering of private information had created grounds for contesting certain marital assets. Helen read this letter, set it down, and said with perfect even-handedness, "He's trying to frighten you." She then wrote a response that I did not read in full, but which apparently addressed the legal questions so thoroughly that Clifford Baines. I stayed in the house during the process, which was my right and which I exercised without apology. Gerald moved into the third bedroom for the first 6 weeks, during which we maintained a civil distance that was, in its own strange way, the most honest our relationship had been in over a year. We passed in the kitchen. We said good morning and good night. We did not eat together. It was an odd, suspended time. The architecture of a shared life still standing around us, while the life itself had already ended. Then he moved to an apartment on the east side, and the house became mine to walk through in the early morning and late evening without adjusting myself to anyone else's schedule or silence. The first morning I woke up alone in the house and made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table without waiting for anyone. I noticed that the quiet had a completely different quality than it had during those weeks of civil distance. It was not an absence. It was simply space. My space. I sat in it for a long time. I stayed in the house during the process, which was my right, and which I exercised without apology. Gerald moved into the third bedroom for the first 6 weeks, during which we maintained a civil distance that was, in its own strange way, the most honest our relationship had been in over a year. We passed in the kitchen. We said good morning and good night. We did not eat together. It was an odd, suspended time. The architecture of a shared life still standing around us while the life itself had already ended. Then he moved to an apartment on the east side, and the house became mine to walk through in the early morning and late evening without adjusting myself to anyone else's schedule or silence. The first morning I woke up alone in the house and made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table without waiting for anyone. I noticed that the quiet had a completely different quality than it had during those weeks of civil distance. It was not an absence. It was simply space. My space. I sat in it for a long time. The settlement took 4 months to negotiate and was, in the end, fair in the way that things are fair when one party has significantly better documentation than the other. I retained the house. I received my full share of Gerald's pension, as was my legal right under Georgia law for a marriage of our duration. Helen had been very clear about this from the beginning, and Clifford Baines had not managed to construct an argument that changed it. We divided the joint accounts without incident, which I attributed partly to the strength of our documentation and partly to the fact that Gerald, whatever else you might say about him, was not a man who wanted to be seen publicly as having behaved badly. He had a certain pride in his own reasonableness, and the settlement, in the end, was the price of maintaining that image. Gerald received his personal property and the retirement account he had maintained separately throughout our marriage. I felt no triumph when the papers were signed. I want to be accurate about that. Triumph would have required an opponent, and by the end of 8 months, I no longer thought of Gerald as an opponent. He was simply a person who had made choices, and I was a person who had made different ones, and the paperwork was the formal acknowledgement of the distance between those choices. What I felt was quieter and more durable. A sense of completion. The way you feel when a long task has been finished correctly and you can set down the tools. The professional consequences for Gerald were limited since he was retired, but the social ones were not, and I think he had underestimated those. Savannah is, despite its size, a town with a long institutional memory, particularly in the circles Gerald and I had occupied for 3 decades. People knew. People had seen Douglas Hartley at our Thanksgiving dinner, and people had heard, in the way that information moves through a community of people who have known each other for years, what that meant. Gerald discovered that the social world he had expected to continue inhabiting was somewhat cooler than he had anticipated. Some of this was the natural consequence of a divorce at his age. Couples reconfigure, invitations shift. But some of it was something more specific, and I suspect he knew what it was. Douglas, for his part, had retained his own attorney within a week of that dinner. His divorce from Renee proceeded in parallel with mine and was, by all accounts I received secondhand through Louise, considerably more acrimonious. Renee had less financial leverage than she'd imagined, and Douglas, who managed money professionally and had done so for 30 years, had a very precise understanding of their joint assets and a very limited tolerance for being deceived by someone he had trusted with his household and his name. He had also, I gathered, kept extremely thorough financial records throughout their marriage, which was the habit of a man in his profession, and which, in this circumstance, served him exceptionally well. She did not come out of it well. Gerald attempted, twice during the 8 months, to suggest that we might reconsider the divorce if I was willing to discuss things. Both times, I referred him to Helen Park, because that was the correct response and also, frankly, the most efficient one. Helen had the patience for those conversations. I did not. The second time he called, late on a Wednesday evening, his voice had something in it that was different from every other version of Gerald I had heard across the 8 months of proceedings. Something unscripted, unmanaged. He asked whether I had ever really loved him, not as an accusation, as a genuine question, from a man who was perhaps for the first time uncertain of an answer he had assumed he knew. I thought about it seriously because it deserved a serious answer. Gerald, I said, I loved you for 30 years before you gave me a reason not to. That should tell you exactly what kind of woman I am, and exactly what you lost. He had no answer for that. We said goodnight, and I did not hear from him again outside of legal correspondence. On the day the divorce was finalized, Patricia drove me to Helen Park's office and waited in the car with the engine running and a playlist she had made specifically for the occasion, which I thought was one of the most thoughtful things she had ever done. When I came out with my copies of the signed documents, she got out and held me for a moment without saying anything, and then she pulled back and looked at my face and said, "Lunch?" We went to a restaurant on the riverfront that Gerald had never particularly liked, and that I had always loved. I ordered the shrimp and grits and a glass of white wine. Patricia had the same. We talked about Tyler's baseball season, and James's reading progress and her garden and my garden and a book I had just started, and the light was good on the river, and the afternoon was long. We did not talk about Gerald. That was, I think, its own kind of victory. Not the loudest or most dramatic kind, but the most real and the most lasting. The ability to sit in the light and talk about ordinary things and feel that ordinary things were, once again, entirely sufficient. I was 68 years old. I had a house and a pension, and my daughter across the table, and a glass of reasonably good white wine, and the rest of the afternoon ahead of me. I had my life back. And it was mine alone, which was not a sadness. It was the point. The first spring after the divorce, I replanted the back garden entirely. I had been meaning to do it for years. The old layout was something Gerald and I had planned together when we first moved in, and it had never quite worked. Too much shade in one corner, the hydrangeas always struggling. I hired a young woman named Grace from the horticultural program at Armstrong University, and together we redesigned the whole bed. We put in a cutting garden along the back fence, dahlias, zinnias, cosmos, and moved the hydrangeas to the east wall, where they finally, that August, bloomed the way they'd always wanted to. I took up watercolor painting that winter. Poorly at first, and then less poorly, and then with a genuine private joy that surprised me. Dr. Collins, whom I continued to see monthly, observed that I seemed to have located a version of myself that had been waiting, patiently, for available space. I thought that was one of the more accurate things anyone had said to me in recent memory. Louise and I began traveling. We went to Charleston in March, to Asheville in June, and this was Louise's idea, which I initially resisted and then enthusiastically embraced, to London in September for 12 days. I was 68 years old in London, walking through Kensington Gardens in a light rain, and I was, without any effort or performance, happy. Not performing happiness, experiencing it. My grandchildren came to the house without the complicated overlay of Gerald's presence, which I had not fully realized was complicated until it was gone. Tyler, now 10, developed the habit of coming on Saturday mornings to help in the garden, a habit I encouraged with considerable enthusiasm and fresh-baked biscuits. James, who had made real progress with his reading, discovered the small library I keep in the sunroom and spent one entire Saturday afternoon working through a picture book about ocean animals and showing me each illustration with the focused seriousness of a scholar presenting a paper. Michael and his partner came for Christmas. We cooked for 3 days and ate for 4 and argued happily about a board game and watched old movies. It was the best Christmas I had spent in many years, which told me something important about what the preceding years had quietly contained. As for Gerald and Renee, I did not seek information about them, but information found me, as it does in a city the size of Savannah among people who have known you for 3 decades. Gerald, I was told by Louise, who had it from a reliable source, had moved in with Renee approximately 4 months after our divorce was finalized. This was, I think, what he had wanted, and I had no particular feeling about it. What he had not anticipated, apparently, was that what works as a secret affair does not always work as a daily domestic arrangement. The qualities in a person that are exciting in concealment can become difficulties in proximity. I heard secondhand that there had been arguments, financial disagreements, that Renee had expected Gerald's resources to be more available than they were, given that his pension was now split. Renee's own financial situation, post-divorce from Douglas, was significantly diminished. Douglas had been, whatever else you might say about him, a thorough professional when it came to asset documentation. She did not receive the settlement she had anticipated. She had given up a stable, financially secure marriage for a situation that was, by all reports, complicated and shrinking. That was not something I had engineered. That was simply the arithmetic of her choices, coming due. I felt no pleasure in hearing this. I want to be clear about that. Pleasure would have meant that I was still defined by them, still living in the aftermath of their decisions. What I felt was closer to a quiet recognition, the same feeling you get when a weather prediction turns out to have been exactly right. I had not destroyed Gerald's life. He had made his choices and was living inside them. That was not my responsibility. It was, and had always been, his. I had one responsibility now: to live my own life, which I was doing, with increasing skill and genuine satisfaction, in a house with a new garden and a Sunday newspaper and a book on my nightstand and a painting that was slowly, imperfectly, becoming something I was proud of. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. They told me to be practical, to be quiet, to accept, at 67, whatever was offered. I chose differently. Here is what I learned, not from books, but from living through it. First, document everything before you confront anyone. Feelings without evidence leave you vulnerable. Evidence without feelings leaves you powerful. Second, the people who urge you to be reasonable are usually the ones who benefit most from your silence. Third, allies matter. I could not have done this alone, not without Louise, not without Helen, not without Patricia standing in that room. Ask for help before you think you need it. Fourth, what a person does in secret tells you who they actually are. The public version is just a performance. Trust the private one. Fifth, it is never too late to choose yourself. I was 67 years old. There is no age at which dignity has an expiration date. Now I want to ask you something. If you had been sitting at that kitchen table with 31 years behind you, a smile on your face, and a stone in your pocket, what would you have done? Would you have confronted him immediately, stayed silent, walked away without a word? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story found you at the right moment, if it gave you something you needed today, you know what to do. Thank you for listening. Truly, it means more than you know.